Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the fifth webinar of our virtual learning series, The State of Pregnant and Parenting Students in California. My name is Dr. Quina Hong, pronouns she, hers, and I serve as the Senior Program Manager for Student Basic Needs with Michelson 20MM Foundation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is being held on the traditional lands of the Tongva people and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. We would like to honor all the ancestral stewards of this land on which we meet today and their descendants living in over 1,000 tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, or native villages. As we get started with the discussion, we will dive into the importance of the forthcoming Title IX updates and what they mean for pregnant and parenting students in California. I would like to first share a bit about the foundation. Founded by Dr. Gary K. Michelson and Alia Michelson, the Michelson 20MM Foundation is dedicated to ensuring that everyone, particularly our most vulnerable populations, has access to equitable post-secondary educational opportunities that lead to a meaningful career. We proudly operate at the cutting edge of higher education to help forward-thinking innovators, nonprofits, and startups close the opportunity gap. At this time, I would also like to take the opportunity to thank our amazing partners, Ascend at the Aspen Institute, Blue Shield of California Foundation, California Competes, the Education Trust West, and Tipping Point Community for helping us make today's webinar possible. It is our hope that you find the conversation engaging, inspiring, and helpful in your work. We invite you to join the discussion using the chat, post questions in the Q&A, and share your stories on Twitter using the hashtag student parents, and our Twitter handle is @Michelson20MM. So we look forward to continuing to further our pregnant and parenting student project under our Student Basic Needs Initiative with a focus on addressing the needs of this population in California. So as many of you already know, more than 1/5 of undergraduate college students in the United States are parents, which is approximately 3.7 million students. Best estimates place California's parenting student population at 20% of all undergraduates, or nearly 487,000 students. Across the nation, student parents are more likely than non-parents to be people of color, women, low income, older than 30, and first-generation college students, which adds layers upon layers of obstacles to degree completion. According to a national student parent survey, 40% of parenting students feel both isolated on their campuses and disconnected from their college community, while 20% feel unwelcome on campus. To uplift and help address the challenges encountered by pregnant and parenting students, the Michelson 20MM Foundation launched our Pregnant and Parenting Student Project. The intent of the project is to support an emerging movement of student parents, educational leaders, and advocates focused on driving systems change for student parents' population. Additionally, the project aims to drive awareness to the experience of the student population, build a community of support for pregnant and parenting students, work towards systems and policy change in California that help pregnant and parenting students thrive. Earlier this year, we dove into the monumental passing of AB 2881, which provides priority registration and resources for pregnant and parenting students. We were joined by legislative champion Assemblymember Mark Berman, as well as members of our CSU Student Parent Network Advisory Committee. Today, we're excited to have Jessica Lee, Senior Staff Attorney at the University of California College of Law, San Francisco Center for Work-Life Law, and Director of Center's Pregnant Scholar Initiative, the National Legal Resource Center for Pregnant and Parenting Students and Postdocs. For the first time in decades, Title IX regulations, which protect pregnant and parenting students, are being updated and are expected to be in effect in October. We will hear about these updates and how practitioners on campus can proactively prepare for the upcoming changes. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jessica Lee.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, and so appreciate the leadership of you, Quina, and the Michelson 20MM Foundation on this issue. So glad you all are here. As briefly mentioned in the introduction, I run the Pregnant Scholar Initiative at the Center for Work-Life Law, UC Law SF. We engage with policymakers and advocates nationwide. We support Title IX coordinators in understanding their compliance obligations, and we directly counsel pregnant and parenting students in need of legal assistance through our Pregnant and Parenting Student Helpline. I am so thrilled to be able to share some of the lessons learned through that work with you here today as you gear up to implement the new Title IX regs on your campus. So today, I'll just go over a quick introduction for those of you who might be new to Title IX. We'll talk about the changes coming in the scope of pregnancy accommodations, moving on to parental leave and absences, and then talk about parenting and harassment and discrimination. So thank you so much, Shaquina, for grounding us in the social context that we're seeing here when it comes to student parents. A huge segment of our student population in California and nationwide are parents, as Quina shared. Oh, my computer is glitching. Hold on, folks. Okay. We know that these parents have about twice the student loan debt, and less than 33, less than a third typically graduate from undergrad in 6 years. But we also know that on average, they have higher GPAs than their childless peers. If there are any student parents, I'd love to hear from you if you're able to share a little bit about your journey as we go through these slides. But I want to address here that we have a lot of barriers, of course, in our society to student parent success. Unfortunately, a significant number of those barriers are controlled by the institutions themselves. So here are some common issues. We see stigmatizing behavior, students being prevented from taking the courses that they need or want, students who are forced to withdraw or prevented from successfully finishing their courses. If you're a student parent, I'm sure you've experienced this, challenges navigating absences, maybe being restricted from what activities you can engage in, or denied a secure and private location to take those lactation breaks you might need. If there are any student parents, again, I'd love to hear from you if you're able to share, and administration true. We see addressing these issues as the low-hanging fruit. We know we need to address food insecurity, housing, a lack of access to affordable childcare, quality childcare. But we see that many institutions can make progress on eliminating some of these barriers within their own institution. And these are also barriers that are most connected to legal rights, like under Title IX. And that's what we're going to be focusing on mostly today. So here's the legal context. The most useful law that we have to support pregnant and parenting students is Title IX. That's a federal law which covers nearly every school in the nation. But the law itself, Title IX, is actually only 37 words. The law is made actionable, made real for folks by regulations put out by the Department of Education. The first ever Title IX regulations were out in 1974, and the section on pregnancy and parenting has barely changed since, until now. In June of last year, the Department of Education released new proposed regulations for public comment. That comment period has come and passed. If you're curious, you can read our letters at pregnantscholar.org. And then last month, in May 2023, we were expecting those regulations to be officially adopted to become law of the land that schools nationwide are following. They've met a bit of a delay, in part because there were hundreds of thousands of comments during that comment period, and they have to go through and respond to all of them. But the Department of Education has stated very clearly in writing that their new deadline for adopting these regulations, these changes to how they interpret Title IX, will be October of this year. So we expect that by the time the spring semester rolls around, post-secondary institutions, K-12, everyone covered by Title IX will need to be fully compliant with these new regulations. If you're like me, in the middle of the semester is a really busy time for you, it's really important not to wait. And that's why I'm so glad you're here now, getting familiar with these regulations so that you can hit the ground running, getting ready for them, and you aren't slammed with it in the middle of the semester. So let's talk about the basic, and at the bottom here, you'll see full text of the proposed regulations is at that link if you want to peruse that yourself. So Title IX, again, those 37 words have a big impact. Title IX covers students or trainees in K-12 schools, colleges, universities, vocational schools, basically any academic institution, government-funded training program, whether it's college and prison, whether it's a library educational opportunity, or whether it's your traditional colleges. Anyone, pretty much every institution in the US is touched by Title IX. Who are the students? Where are these students covered? It's in any class, externship, internship, or training program that's sponsored or required by their institution and overseen by their institution. So that means a student parent or a pregnant student in a big lecture class is covered, but they're also covered in field research that's overseen by their professor. They're covered in externships, internships, anything with that close affiliation to the school. And now, how are they covered? Well, Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and pregnancy-related conditions, and it requires certain accommodations. So I'm going to walk you through exactly what that means, because again, small words, huge impact, right? So under the status quo, under the law as we've known it since the 70s, Title IX covers anything that's pregnancy related. So it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, which means it prohibits discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, which means on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, false pregnancy, termination of pregnancy, which is a technical term that includes miscarriage and abortion, and recovery and related conditions. But this is getting an update. Now the rules make clear that discrimination is banned on the basis of those conditions, as well as lactation, which is viewed as a pregnancy-related condition. And this law is now interpreted by the Department of Education to include not only someone's current pregnancy, but also their potential for pregnancy or past pregnancy or conditions relating to pregnancy. So if a student is undergoing IVF, if the student is pregnant, or if the student had a miscarriage and isn't pregnant anymore, they're all protected under these new Title IX regulations. It also bans discrimination on the basis of sex and parental status, and those two have to go together. So Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and being a parent. And for the first time ever, these new Title IX regulations are explaining just what they mean by being a parent. It includes being a biological parent, adoptive parent, foster parent, anyone who has or is seeking custody, guardianship, visitation of a child under 18 or someone who's disabled and over 18. Next basic aspect of Title IX that I'll cover here is what happens when someone violates the law. Well, this hasn't changed. A student can file a Title IX complaint at their institution, but there are some changes to what institutions and employees need to be doing in relation to that. So first of all, in the past, there was a mistaken assumption that Title IX investigates only sexual assault or sexual harassment, but that's not true. And these regulations now make clear that Title IX offices have to promote their complaint processes, have to investigate violations of the law beyond sexual harassment and sexual assault. So if you are a student parent and you've been discriminated against, the Title IX complaint process has to be accessible to you. Part of this broader view of Title IX also means that employees now will have to report sex discrimination unless they're a confidential employee. So if you are a professor at a college, you are most likely going to be responsible for reporting sex discrimination if you see it, which I think is a big change that schools really should be preparing for, especially when they're thinking of training faculty. The next option for students, if there's a violation, is that they can file a complaint with the Department of Education. And the final one is that student can file a lawsuit. Students and employees, anyone at the institution, can enforce Title IX. You don't have to follow step 1 before you go to step 2 or 3. Any of these options are available. And I think that's part of the reason why these new regulations are so important for people to get ahead of. I'm a lawyer, but I don't sue anybody. I don't want to see educational institutions get sued. I want to help folks prevent these problems before they start. So again, really glad you're here. All right, let's talk about the first time many pregnant students are going to need Title IX. Pregnancy accommodations. Now, this is a real quote from a student with a disability that was caused by childbirth. She was coming back to school. She wanted to pursue her degree full force after a really lengthy recovery. But when she got back, her professor and mentor said to her, "What are you talking about? You don't have a disability. You just need to go home and be with your baby." Now, that is the land that we were living in. When pregnant students asked for help, they were all too often denied it. The new Title IX regulations make clear what institutions now have to provide. So it's not too complicated. If a student is saying any of these things, that's a sign that they may need an accommodation. So if a student reaches out to a professor and says, "I don't fit in this chair," or "It's hard for me to type," maybe they just say, "Hey, I was in the hospital, sorry." Any of these trigger words should immediately spark a conversation about accommodations. Students often don't know the term accommodation or reasonable academic adjustment, but if they need a change in the classroom or of any policy of their academic institution, that is considered an accommodation. And here are some examples. We see students getting accommodations that delay deadlines, give them bathroom breaks, permission to eat or drink in class, access to a parking space if it's hard for them to walk long distances across campus, permission to avoid toxic substances that might harm their pregnancy, remote learning, or just a larger chair so that they can sit more comfortably. And you see I have these pictures here of these desks. They are a constant struggle for very pregnant students. It can range from all of these to basically whatever a student may need so that they can safely and comfortably continue with their education. Now, for a very long time, the Title IX regulations said, yes, you have to give the same sorts of accommodations that you give to folks with temporary disabilities. You might have to make adjustments. But these two paragraphs were the core of the information folks had available to them. It really was not well described. And so it was very confusing to a lot of people what those academic adjustments, what those accommodations would need to look like. Here's how the process should work. First, the school determines if someone's pregnancy, or maybe they're disabled or have an impairment. Then they look at whether the accommodation the student asked for matches the impairment. So it probably wouldn't be responsive to ask for remote school if you have pregnancy-induced carpal tunnel, right? It might be more appropriate for you to have a note taker or assistance typing. But that would be a responsive accommodation if your doctor put you out on bed rest. The final question is the accommodation reasonable? Meaning, does the accommodation cost an unworkable amount of money? Does it fundamentally alter the nature of the course? So thinking again about somebody asking for virtual classes, that would be reasonable in a lot of lecture classes, but it probably wouldn't work for a nursing clinical program where the entire point of the class is to get in-person patient contact. So this is the basic test. This has not changed. What has changed is how professors, how employees, administrators are processing this request. So right now, the best case scenario is one where the student goes to a professor for help. That professor gives affirmation. Thanks for asking. I'm going to help you out, right? If they can change the thing immediately, do it. So for example, grabbing a different table or chair for that student, that's easy. If they need more help, they should seek that help, get it, and then engage in an interactive process with that student to figure out a change that works. But in reality, we see breaks in every part of this process. This should be very straightforward, but we see that this process as is actually hurting students in many circumstances. And I should warn, if you're a student parent, you might have heard some of these negative comments. This might be tough to hear again. But we see faculty members who are making negative statements to students about their pregnancy, saying, for example, "Are you sure you want to keep it?" Or "What a disappointment. I thought you were a serious scientist, a serious student." We see questions about the student's family makeup, like, "Do you know who the father is?" That's one we get a lot. And we often see intrusive medical questions, like a professor wanting to talk to a student's doctor about what's going on with their health. That is, those are common fails in the accommodation process as is. And they often result in students being told, this last point here, you should just withdraw. When folks can't get the accommodations they need, this seems to be the go-to, which of course is absolutely devastating for students and their families. Right when they need that education the most, right when they need the support of the campus the most, they are out in the cold, often with debt and with lowered earning potential. So this is what we don't want to see, but what happens all too often. That said, one of the biggest breakdowns in all of this is when that professor should be seeking help, right? Some just don't seek help at all. Or on most campuses, there are any number of people who might be responsible for managing the accommodations. So we might see student affairs having a role, Title IX, the Disability Accessibility Office, or sometimes there's just a staff member who has informally taken this on. It's rarely written down and publicized where professors or students should go to get help with this, which means a lot of work for pregnant students to find the help that they need and a lot of chances for them to fall through the cracks. So, talked a lot about the failures. Those informal processes are challenging because they're not backed up by resources. A lot of times these staff members who are in the middle of managing this don't have the authority to require accommodations that students need. We also see issues with disability-centered processes. They're often designed for longer-term disabilities. So they have deadlines, they have forms that are really challenging for pregnant students to get in and get processed while they need that help. And then we see a lot of disability stigma. I once had a student tell me, "I don't have a disability, I just can't use my hands." That is why some of the existing processes are not serving pregnant students well. And again, lead to that terrible, "you should just withdraw." Under the new regulations, this is being addressed in writing, formally, in the Federal Register for the very first time. The Department of Education will now require schools to provide reasonable modifications to their policies, practices, or procedures for a student because of their pregnancy or related condition, and they must be provided be provided on an individualized and voluntary basis. So right now, this fall, the new process should be that the faculty member learns of the pregnancy or that pregnant student's need, and they refer to the Title IX officer. That Title IX officer is now required to provide the student with information about pregnancy accommodations, leave, lactation accommodations. They'll be required to oversee that individualized and interactive process to establish accommodations, and they have to address complaints. So this doesn't mean the Title IX officer has to do this all their own. That could be informed by the disability office, that could be informed by student affairs, but the ultimate responsibility is going to belong with the Title IX coordinator, and they're going to be responsible for effectively implementing, coordinating, and documenting what is going on. I have a little checklist for Title IX coordinators at the bottom here, where we list out what needs to be done in a conversation with a pregnant student and some resources that can help as you do that. But I think it's really important for folks here to make sure that folks within their university community are aware of this shift. Most Title IX coordinator offices are really stretched thin as is. And opening up this new area of responsibility in such a clear black and white way is going to require more resources. And so that's why we're waving these flags. We're trying to get the word out as early as possible so that folks can prepare their process. Here's an example. This is a real story and a real student with adorable baby here, Marcela Maris. She reached out to me after this happened. And so she is breastfeeding, she's lactating. She requested to turn off her camera to breastfeed during virtual class. Her professor called breastfeeding weird, her request inappropriate, and said that she would be penalized for going off camera. So first of all, hopefully this is clear. The comments, huge concern. There's also the policy issue, the penalty she'd be facing. She is asking for an accommodation here for the usual camera on policy to not apply. That's a pretty reasonable request, and I think it could be handled instantly. But if that professor needed help, like if there's some sort of campus policy that needed changing before the new regulations, they probably wouldn't know where to go, right? Is the disability office handling breastfeeding and lactation issues? Is the student parent center negotiating on behalf of the student? There was not a really good fit. Under the new Title IX regulations, this professor should be referring her to the Title IX office. The Title IX coordinator would make sure that there are accommodations to meet her needs, communicate them with the professor, and document them. Hopefully that Title IX coordinator would also make clear that belittling the student is completely unacceptable and would guard her from retaliation as well. And this seems like the perfect point to raise that. You might say I've been mentioning lactation. Under the 2023 guidelines, educational institutions now have to provide all students and employees with lactation accommodations, including a private and clean lactation space. So students and workers have been entitled to this under California law for a while, but there is a new layer of protection now. And again, students can sue under Title IX. So now is the time to make changes. And we have resources available at pregnantscholar.org if you need a lactation support policy. Okay, moving on. We're past pregnancy, it's time to have the baby. Title IX regulations also address student leave. Want to start off with a reminder that if a student has the full set of accommodations they need, they're less likely to need lengthy leave. But for students who do give birth, they will likely still need some time off. And I'd, again, love to hear in the chat what you think the norm is around student maternity leave. So here's a quote here from a parent. She wrote, "I was in a lot of pain on her, this was her first day back. And she remembers thinking to herself, I shouldn't be here. This is all too common. There's a belief that students who give birth need to come back right away. Sometimes that's the student the student's wishes, sometimes that's just a violation of the law. Let's talk about what the law requires. I've included an actual screenshot here because frankly, a lot of folks just don't believe me when I say this. But Title IX has, since the 1970s, required that educational institutions provide a leave of absence for pregnancy and recovery, pregnancy-related conditions, childbirth recovery, for as long a period of time as is deemed medically necessary by the student's physician. This has been the law, it will remain. So as long as medically necessary is determined by the student's own care provider, and that might include time off for doctor's appointments, leave during pregnancy if they have complications, childbirth leave to recover from childbirth, and leave related to abortion or miscarriage. Again, medical necessity is their own doctor's view, not the school's. The trickier part of this is making sure that the student parent is able to come back in the same status that they held before being out on leave. So that means guaranteed readmittance to the program. You have to hold their spot. You can't tell them, oh, you have to reapply. You know, we like you, we think we might let you in. That happens a lot. That is illegal. And no penalty or grade deductions just because they're out. So we see this a lot with classes that have participation credits. You cannot dock a student participation credits for medically necessary pregnancy absences. All of that is not changing, but there are a few aspects of this which are being tweaked in the new regulations. First of all, the Department of Education might be giving us some more guidance on how to handle intermittent absences as opposed to those long-term absences. So we know it's all very different, right? Missing a class here or there for a pregnancy appointment is different from needing to miss 2 or 3 months. We're hoping that the final rules are going to give a little bit more clarity on this, fingers crossed. But some things we do know are coming out is that now educational institutions have to accept notes from any licensed healthcare provider, not just doctors. So if somebody's RN or midwife or licensed lactation consultant writes them a note, that has to be respected. We also will have this fall limitations on requiring medical certification to return after leave. So the old Title IX regulation said, yes, you can accept notes. You can require doctors to write notes for that student to come back to school, as long as you have the same kind of policies for other students with health conditions. Now, that certification to return to class has to be actually linked to the class or the program or the extracurricular activity. So it needs to be necessary, right? You can't just say, we need your doctor to sign you off to return to class when it's just any old class that's not required of other folks. This is a big change, especially for folks who cover pregnant students under their medical withdrawal policy. So a lot of times we see this where a student has to apply to return, they have to submit a whole bunch of medical paperwork just because they gave birth. That is now going to need to change under these new regulations. You can only request that certification if certification is required of all students participating in the class, and it's tied to their physical needs in that class. And then finally, the Department of Education has also made clear now that the student, after coming back from leave, has to be reinstated to the same extracurricular status too, if practicable. And I encourage folks, if you're managing a sports program, check out the NCAA guidance on pregnancy, because there's some very useful tools there for figuring out return to that same extracurricular status. So let's think about this for a second. Here's an example. Jada's due in a month, but due to complications, she was admitted to the hospital 3 weeks before the semester ends. I encourage everyone to just take a second and think about their campus and how this would work. What leave or accommodation options would she have? Well, best case scenario under old and new Title IX laws is that regulations is that she would be able to continue from the hospital if she wanted to, either remote work or taking home some assignments that would be equivalent to what she would be doing if she was actually physically present. Maybe you get her notes, send notes home. Or perhaps if she's unable to participate, doesn't want to, she gets an incomplete with the option to finish at a fair pace once she has recovered. These changes in the regulations don't really touch how that should work in the ideal circumstance, but they do, again, require certain responsibilities, right? So instead of it being a professor emailing a student in the hospital or a dean emailing a student in the hospital, the Title IX coordinator should be air traffic control here, making sure that these conversations are being held in a fair way that gives her the opportunity to express her needs and to have a fair shot at completing this semester, a fair and equitable shot, right? We don't want to tell her, hey, do all of your coursework the day after you give birth. That's not responsive to her needs. And if you have any questions about how this plays out, just a reminder, pop them in the Q&A while you're thinking about them, and we will have some time at the end. So I've talked a lot about the birthing student. What about student parents generally? We'll be talking a lot more for the next few minutes about them. I just want to flag here, that is a huge issue with Title IX. It does not specifically provide leave other than leave that's medically necessary for the pregnant or birthing student. So if somebody, if someone's a dad, for example, and they're not giving birth, they want time off to care for their new baby, Title IX does not require that be provided unless it's given to others. So caretaking or bonding leave that's not linked to someone's physical condition has to be provided equally without regard to sex or gender. So Jada from that last example could get time off for her health needs, but she's not entitled to time off when her baby needs it. That same thing would apply if Jada has a husband. He would not be entitled to time off for the baby. It has to be equal. So non-discrimination and harassment. There's a lot of confusion about whether student parents are protected and how they are protected. Again, a quick refresher on how Title IX works. Looking back to these basic principles, we see that any pregnant or birthing student is protected for anything related to pregnancy or birthing. So that's no discrimination based on pregnancy, intent to be pregnant, past being pregnant. It's all covered under that principle that pregnancy is tightly linked to sex. And again, when we're thinking about parental status, the requirement is not just that the person's a parent, but that the discrimination must somehow be linked to their sex or gender, and that is tougher. So let's dig in. The real question here for student parents is, are they being treated differently on the basis of sex or gender? And so that includes being treated differently on the basis of pregnancy or parental status, relating to sex. It also means gender roles. And this is something that's been articulated for the very first time in these regulations. It is treating a student differently on the basis of sex or gender to treat them differently based on your views of what's a good man or a good woman, what makes a good father, mother, student. It is also illegal to discriminate against parents due to sex-linked stereotypes about parents, their competence, their availability, their commitment. All of that is now captured in the new Title IX regulations. For those of you who have been to one of my trainings, you may have heard me say this before, and you're scratching your heads when I say this is new. The legal principle isn't new. We've used it in the employment space for decades, but this is the first time it will be clearly expressed for students in these Title IX regulations. And it's really important. You know, for a long time, parenting was seen as women's work. There are lots of sex-linked stereotypes out there about people of any gender who are taking an active parenting role. And that is what Title IX protects for the parenting students. So we see statements like, I know your priorities have changed, or pregnant women can't handle X. We see something, what I call the magnifying glass, more critical assessments post-birth or after finding out someone is a parent, hunting for signs of lowered competence. Or the time warp, isn't that your wife's job? It's not fair to the other students to let you take a vacation just because you're a dad now. These sorts of statements are all huge red flags for Title IX violations, whether they're explicitly saying you're not welcome or not. These are pointing to sex-based stereotypes about parenting. Here's an example of a harassment case. Tina Varlisi was a graduate student in social work at Wayne State University. She was assigned to an internship placement as part of fulfilling her degree requirements. While she was there, she received harassing comments and low ratings from the internship supervisor, who wasn't employed by the university, but she reported it. When she reported it, there was not a proper investigation, and Tina ended up getting pushed out of her program. They had a chance to investigate. Title IX did not step in, right? There were not these clear lines of authority. And because of her lost career opportunities and violations of Title IX, the university was fined over $800,000. Here's another case of harassment. Michael requested to miss class to take his newborn baby to the doctor. Other students have received excused absences for a variety of reasons, including extracurriculars. But the professor responded to Michael's request by asking him to prove that he's a caregiver and that his wife can't take the baby. This is real life, y'all. Unbelievable. The professor later said that the absence will be unexcused as there's no such thing as daddy leave. This just isn't something we do. Hopefully, all of the red flags are going off for you here. First of all, the professor's in the wrong by assuming that he has a wife, assuming that Michael can't provide care, or that his wife should do it instead. He would also be subject to a Title IX investigation for not excusing the absence, right? Other students get excused absences for other reasons, so Michael should as well. So that is the equality argument that we are making under Title IX to protect parenting students. It's not an equity argument. Michael is not entitled to extra days that other students don't get under law, maybe morality. But he is entitled to whatever others are getting, to not be treated less than other students because he's a dad providing care. So I say this here, if your school only uses Title IX, it's likely not protecting parenting students enough for the very reason that I just gave, that example. But the new regulations do lay the groundwork for protections for parenting students. For example, the new regulations explain the strains that the students are under and express the interpretation that parental bias is shaped by sex bias. But all of this is still a bit gray. I'm not expecting most faculty members to be thinking about the sex stereotyping they might be doing when not providing dads time off to care for their kids. So I want everyone to think about what parenting accommodations could look like and paths for making that real on their campus. I think getting these new Title IX regulations in place, implementing them with an eye towards these biases is going to lay the foundation for a much broader conversation about equity for parenting students beyond birth. So we've talked about a lot here. I am going to ask the foundation to send out these slides so that you have some little cliff notes here. But just a refresher, we now have clear definitions for pregnancy, for parenting. Educational institutions are now going to be required to provide information to pregnant students on their rights, to make those modifications, and to report and investigate sex discrimination, including discrimination against pregnant and parenting students when they see it. I have a few resources available to folks at pregnantscholar.org. If you want to be notified when the new regulations come out, and hopefully also notified on our more detailed trainings when we have the final ink on paper, you can visit this link here or copy this QR code and it'll take you right to it. Now I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This was so informative. I think like I've been reading so much about it, but just hearing about it and seeing examples has just been so much more like, hello, like I can't believe these things are happening, but also so glad that there are new protections coming down the pipeline, hopefully, right? So yes, we did get a few questions in the chat as well as our Q&A box. So I'll read them off to you. So the first question was just, does the new Title IX regulation apply to parenting students or only pregnant students? I know at the very beginning of your presentation, you talked a lot about the pregnant students, students who are pregnant, but also parenting students later. So how would you interpret that?
Right. So pregnant students are clearly covered because pregnancy is sex linked. Parenting students are also covered, but the rule is they can't be discriminated against on the basis of sex. So if you're a parenting student and you're being treated differently in a way that's bringing up some of those sex-based stereotypes, or that's just having a negative impact on parents of a certain gender, that would be Title IX issue. I think the overall message that we should be sending, though, is that Title IX coordinators need to be on alert for all of these various types of bias on their campus. And as the Department of Education says in their new regulations, really be working to prevent this bias, to understand what's happening on their campus and take that affirmative action to make sure that parenting students still have an equal shot at an education, because this is just too much for folks to be interpreting on their own every day.
Thank you. So the next question was, are there updated handouts or infographics that you have with the new 2023 updates?
Yeah, we do have a checklist for Title IX coordinators and a summary of the new proposed regulations. It's all available on pregnantscholar.org. If you look under our toolkits banner. But we are saving the full slew of infographics and handouts for when we have the final text, because we want to make sure that we aren't getting into the weeds on anything that is tweaked in the very final wording. So, but I will say, if you look at any of the tools available on pregnantscholar.org, those were already designed with best practice in mind. So they will be setting you up for success under the new regulations, even if they're not explicitly referencing the new regulations.
Yeah, and everything that Jessica had mentioned in terms of resources and links will be sent out in an email after this, including the presentation as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar. So the next question is from Haley in the chat. So my question around guaranteed readmittance is around timeliness. I have faculty ask me how to figure it out, how they are expected to have the student come back when they are not teaching. So is this now the Title IX office's responsibility to work on these issues?
Yes, it's absolutely the Title IX office's responsibility to work on these issues. And I think that's Haley's example speaks to why it's so important to have one person in a position of authority negotiating this. It's really challenging for folks to do that across the campus if they are not invested with the authority to do so. In terms of that readmission, it really should be that interactive conversation with the student to try to get a sense of what their needs are, if they know. Pregnancy can be surprising. A lot of times students have premature labor or complications they weren't expecting. But to the extent you can plan in advance, following the student's wishes to create a plan to return is best practice. And yeah, we see folks do incompletes. Sometimes it's an incomplete plus waiving a pre or co-requisite. Sometimes it's helping that student find a course at another institution that they could take to get that credit. There are a million and one ways to make it work, but I think the bottom line with this new regulations is that the Title IX coordinator is responsible for being creative and having those conversations to keep the student on track.
Thank you. And then we have one last question. Would this apply? I like these like case study what ifs. So a student's 10-year-old has COVID. The mom or the parent stays home to take care of their sick child and cannot take their final. Could the mom get an incomplete? Probably based off of Title IX.
Yeah, so the mom should be able to get it incomplete. On the morality question here, right? We want to support our parenting students. And again, think about equity, not just equality. But unfortunately, under Title IX, that student parent is not entitled to that time off, which is why, again, we think of these Title IX regulations as a baseline. Think of it as the ceiling. I mean, think of it as the floor and not the ceiling, because we don't want to leave that parent who's home with a sick child out in the cold.
Great. Thank you. Just want to give folks one more minute or so to ask any questions in the chat. I know the chat is going off in terms of it'd be really great for all Title IX coordinators to receive this information or training. That feel like that could be something in the works, but definitely sharing the information about this as much and broadly as possible. Great.
Yes. And thank you for those of you sharing your stories here in the chat. I encourage folks to spread the word about this on their campus. And really, one of the most stunning things that we saw in the new regulations is that everyone now is responsible for reporting sex discrimination, including discrimination against pregnant or parenting students. So this is a new change, a new day for pregnant and parenting students, and hopefully the entire university community will step up to make sure that this isn't happening to future generations. Thank you all so much for sharing.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I'll go ahead and close us out. So thank you so much for this incredible conversation, everybody who has attended today. We hope that you all walk away from today's event informed, inspired, and ready to implement some of these supports and resources on your own campuses. So before you head out, we request that you take 1 minute to complete our post-event evaluation. The link will be dropped in the chat as I close our timeout here today. So the State of Pregnant and Parenting Students in California was presented by the Michelson 20mm Foundation as part of our mission to advance equity for all students and families. We want to again thank our partners, Ascend at the Aspen Institute, Blue Shield of California Foundation, California Competes, the Education Trust West, and the Tipping Point community. Thank you for helping make today happen. So we invite you to join us again on this journey. Continue to ask the questions about what work is being done on your own campuses and how are you serving the pregnant and parenting students? Who are they and how are you reaching them? How are their voices being heard and incorporated into your own equity work? The recording of today's discussion will be posted on YouTube on our YouTube channel, the Michelson 20mm Foundation, by tomorrow. To learn more about our work with pregnant and parenting students, visit our website using the link in the chat. Additionally, if you or your organization wants to become part of our work focused on supporting pregnant and parenting students, please reach out to me personally at q.hoang@200mm.org. And that's q.hong@20mm.org. You can also stay engaged by signing up for our newsletter at 20mm.org to receive news and updates about our pregnant and parenting student projects, as well as other events and programs. Thank you again for joining us and for centering the needs of pregnant and parenting students. Have a great rest of your day.